I knew something was wrong the minute he showed up smiling. Not the warm kind of smile, the one you give someone you've missed. No, this was the kind you practice in a mirror, all teeth and no eyes. My name is Lorraine Granger. I'm 79 years old, widowed for the better part of a decade, and until recently, I thought I had raised my son to be decent. Not perfect, no, but decent. What I'm about to share is something I never thought I'd admit, even to myself. My own son tried to sell the home I still lived in, the home his father and I built with our bare hands, without my consent. And the truth is, I almost let him. The house sits on a quiet street just beyond the city line, one of those suburbs where the trees outlive the families. We bought the lot in 1972 when my husband Peter came back from a long-haul trucking contract and said he wanted to put down roots. We couldn't afford much, but he sketched the plans on graph paper and said we'd figure it out as we went. And we did. We poured the foundation together, framed walls in the dead heat of summer. We scavenged old wood, laid tile we couldn't quite level, and painted each room with colors we picked after arguing in hardware store aisles for hours. Every part of this place has a story. The dent in the baseboard by the kitchen? That's from when Derek ran his tricycle too fast around the corner. The stain in the guest room carpet? That was grape juice from my granddaughter's tea party when she was 4 and called me her queen. People look at the house now and see creaky floors and an aging roofline. But to me, it's memory made solid. Even after Peter passed, I never once considered leaving. The quiet suited me. I knew where everything was. And more importantly, everything in it still knew me. Derek would visit now and then. He's a real estate agent, the kind who wears watches bigger than his wrists and says things like, "up-and-coming neighborhood," with a straight face. He always came with a reason, never just to talk. But that day, when he walked through the door with color swatches and brochures, I thought, maybe this time it's different. Maybe he's finally seeing what this house means. I let myself believe that for about 15 minutes. Then he opened his laptop. Derek always moved fast. Even as a boy, he hated waiting. If something didn't change quickly enough, he lost interest. That part of him never grew out. So it shouldn't have surprised me that once I said yes to the idea of freshening up the place, he acted like I'd handed him the keys to the kingdom. He brought in floor samples the next morning, rolled out catalogs like maps across my dining table. He called it Phase 1, with a grin, like this was the first step in some grand campaign. I smiled politely, letting him talk, though the names of the paint colors made me dizzy. Arctic whisper, salted breeze, soft twilight. Not one of them sounded like a real thing, just air. "This'll open the space up," he said, pointing to a mock-up of the living room without the old bookshelves. "And if we knock this wall back here, you'll get better light in the kitchen." He spoke fast, like a salesman on a clock, not a son standing in his childhood home. I looked over at the wall he meant. It was where Peter's birthday photos used to hang, lined up by year. Derek hadn't noticed I'd taken them down last spring, after the frames began to tilt, and the glass kept slipping. I asked him what he had in mind for the upstairs. He barely glanced up. "Nothing big. Maybe replace the carpet, update the bathroom tile. You'll thank me later when it's time to downsize. No one wants shag anymore, Mom." I nodded. It wasn't worth pushing against him. I wasn't ready to say no yet, even though part of me already wanted to. There was something tempting in his energy, his sense of purpose. I hadn't seen that kind of spark in this house since Peter passed. I told myself it was a good thing, that maybe Derek needed this just as much as I needed company. He mentioned the grandkids a lot, said they'd love visiting a house that felt current, used words like value, equity, long-term positioning. At one point he said, "This is really a gift to the family, Mom." And I admit I swallowed that line like honey. It sounded kind. It sounded true. So I let him move forward. I agreed to paint samples. I agreed to new counters. I even agreed to the temporary removal of the porch swing, though it nearly broke my heart to see it taken down. He promised everything was cosmetic, easy to reverse. "You won't believe the before and after," he said, like we were contestants on some home show. But somewhere behind his compliments and fast hands, I began to feel a chill. It wasn't what he was doing, it was what he wasn't saying. I kept waiting for a pause, a moment when he'd sit beside me on the couch and ask how I felt about it all. But that moment never came. Within days, the house stopped feeling like mine. Men with tool belts came through the front door as if they'd always had the right. They didn't knock. They waved politely, called me ma'am, and got to work. One was measuring windows, another taking pictures of the fireplace. Derek moved among them like a foreman, nodding and pointing, his voice always a few notches louder than necessary. I stayed out of the way, mostly in the kitchen. I made muffins the first day, then cookies the next, thinking maybe the scent of cinnamon or butter would remind Derek of something soft, something rooted. He thanked me each time, distracted, his eyes on his phone. I sat at the breakfast table while voices echoed from the other rooms. The walls seemed thinner somehow, like the house itself was holding its breath. The paint went up first, pale grays and whites. Nothing warm. "Neutral cells," Derek said, when I asked if we could keep the sage green in the den. That had been Peter's favorite room. He used to sit there after dinner, feet up, humming to the radio. I thought about insisting, but Derek looked so sure of himself, so in control. I didn't want to be difficult. After the new floors were installed, Derek brought in a photographer, a woman in tight jeans with a camera nearly as big as her torso. She snapped pictures of the entryway, the kitchen, the backyard, though I noticed she avoided the sewing room entirely. That was the one space I had asked him not to touch. My sanctuary. My own. I should have asked more questions then. I should have noticed the way Derek angled the photos, the way he talked to the photographer about sight lines and market-ready polish. But I was tired. And maybe part of me didn't want to see what was already being arranged behind my back. Some nights, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the new sounds of the house. Tools left overnight, the echo of empty hallways where boxes had been packed and shoved aside. Derek was always gone by sundown, promising to return early the next day with the next phase. He used that phrase often, like it was a game plan we had drawn up together. But we hadn't. I was following along, half a step behind, nodding to things I didn't understand and signing off on decisions I hadn't made. Still, I told myself it was temporary. Just updates. Just paint and polish. Then one afternoon I opened the door expecting a delivery and instead found a smiling couple holding a printed flyer. The woman leaned in and asked, "Is this the open house?" My heart caught in my chest. I looked at her, then down at the flyer in her hand, and saw my own home pictured beneath bold block letters. She smiled again as if I were the host. I told her gently she must have the wrong address, but I already knew she didn't. After the couple left, I closed the front door quietly and just stood there. I didn't move for a long time. The flyer was still in my hand, the picture of my own house printed in glossy color, with a cheerful caption that read, "Charming renovation opportunity, prime location." There was even a line about plenty of natural light, as if the sun had signed a lease. I sat down on the edge of the stairs. The banister felt unfamiliar beneath my fingers. My mouth was dry, but I didn't reach for water. I just stared at the flyer and tried to find a version of this moment that didn't mean what I already knew it did. When Derek came by that evening, I didn't greet him at the door. I waited in the living room, the flyer folded neatly on the coffee table. He walked in like he always did, calling out, "Hey, Mom!" with that breezy, too casual tone he uses when he's hoping I won't ask questions. I asked anyway. "There was a couple here today," I said, without raising my voice. "They were looking for an open house." He stopped in the doorway. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it. Then he shrugged, tossed his keys onto the counter and said, "I was going to tell you. I just wanted to get a little traction first. You said I could fix the place up, remember? This is how we make it count." I stared at him, not blinking. "You listed the house, Derek, while I'm still living in it." He raised his hands, defensive but still smiling, like this was some small misunderstanding. "It's not a big deal. We haven't accepted an offer or anything. Look, it's time you had something simpler anyway. No stairs, no old pipes to deal with. I've already scoped out a condo downtown, all one level, new appliances, lots of natural light. You'll love it." His words floated in the air like sales copy. I didn't interrupt. I just let him finish. When he finally stopped talking, I nodded slowly and said, "Let me sleep on it." That seemed to satisfy him. He patted my shoulder like a nurse might comfort a patient and went off to take a phone call on the porch. I listened to him laugh and pace while I sat alone in the living room, my hands folded tight in my lap. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in bed, eyes open to the dark, listening to the soft creak of the house settling around me. This place had always had a voice of its own. Peter used to say you could hear what a home felt if you listened closely enough, and what I heard now was warning me. By morning, the edges of my pillow were damp, though I hadn't cried. It was something else. A weight I couldn't shake. I sat up slowly, my joints stiff from a night spent thinking instead of sleeping. Outside, the light was just beginning to break through the blinds. The house was quiet, the way it always was before coffee and birdsong. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't fold the laundry or water the porch plants. I picked up the phone and dialed Margot. She and I met 30 years ago at church potlucks, when our children were still young and our husbands were still around. She'd worked as a paralegal for most of her adult life and never lost her sharpness. Even after retirement, she stayed current. When I heard her voice pick up, steady and clear, I felt something in my chest unclench. I told her what happened. I tried to keep it brief, but the words came quickly, rushed and raw. She listened without interrupting. When I mentioned the couple at the door, the listing flyer, Derek's calm dismissal, she made a sound under her breath that was half sympathy, half something sterner. "Do you have the deed?" she asked. That question landed like an anchor. I did. I kept it in the drawer under the old phone book, the same place it had sat untouched for decades. I hadn't looked at it since Peter passed. My fingers trembled as I opened the drawer and slid the document out. Margot waited while I checked. My name. No one else's. I read it again, then a third time, slower. I had never transferred anything to Derek. Not partial ownership, not survivorship, nothing. "You're still the sole owner," Margot confirmed when I told her. "That's good. That's very good." But it didn't feel good. It felt like the floor had just shifted under me. If I never gave him any legal right to the property, how had he listed it? Margot asked if I'd signed anything recently, even casually. I thought back over the past weeks. The only things I'd agreed to were paint colors and cabinet finishes. I had never signed a listing agreement, never touched a contract. Margot exhaled. "Then he forged it." That word sounded too large for my kitchen. I looked around at the familiar space, my tea mug still on the counter, the faded magnets on the fridge, the apron Peter gave me the Christmas before he got sick, and the idea that my own son could fake my signature to sell the one place I'd ever truly belonged felt impossible. But the evidence was there. He had done it. He had smiled in my face and done it anyway. I didn't scream. I didn't call him. I didn't even let the anger rise. What came instead was a cold, clear kind of stillness, The kind you get right before a storm, when everything slows down and sharpens. I thanked Margot and hung up. Then I called a lawyer. The lawyer's office was in a quiet part of town, tucked behind a dentist's clinic and a florist. I hadn't stepped foot in a law office since Peter and I signed our wills 25 years earlier. Back then, everything felt straightforward. We had each other, we had this house, and we trusted the natural order of things. That trust had cracked. My attorney, a woman named Teresa, was patient and precise. I handed her the deed and explained what had happened, trying to keep my voice steady. She listened carefully, asked the right questions, then nodded with a kind of focused calm that told me this wasn't the first time she'd seen a family member cross a line. She pulled up the online listing. There it was. My address. My home. Framed like a commodity. Photographs of my kitchen, my garden, my bedroom. All tidied to look less lived in. Even the porch swing had returned, repainted and hung again, as if that alone would soften the sale. I felt my stomach tighten. The description used words like motivated seller and vacant possession available. Vacant. As if I were already gone. He submitted false documents, Teresa said after reviewing the case, including a forged listing agreement. That's not just unethical, that's illegal. I nodded but said nothing. My hands were folded tightly in my lap. We'll file a cease and desist immediately, she continued. I'll also notify the listing platform and the brokerage. They'll have to remove it once they realize there's no legal authority. It happened faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, the listing was gone. The pictures disappeared. The calls stopped. The doorbell didn't ring. No more strangers peering over the fence or pulling into the driveway. The house exhaled. So did I. Derek found out that evening. I didn't tell him. The broker must have. Because not long after sunset, my phone lit up with his name. I let it ring. The first voicemail was clipped and angry. He demanded an explanation, called the situation embarrassing, and accused me of sabotaging his reputation. The second voicemail came an hour later. His tone had shifted. Now he called me ungrateful, said he'd only been trying to help, claimed this was all for my benefit, that I couldn't live alone forever, that I didn't understand how hard he was working to make things easier for everyone. I listened to that one all the way through, then deleted it. The third message came just before midnight. His voice was quiet, almost pleading. He said he didn't mean to hurt me, that families have to stick together, that I was overreacting. I didn't return the call. I didn't pick up the next day either, or the one after that. Instead, I sat in the den, surrounded by the scent of old books and new paint, and began to make a plan of my own. The house felt different now, quieter somehow. Not from the absence of contractors or visitors, but from the absence of pretense. I no longer had to pretend not to notice what Derek had been doing. I no longer had to wonder if I was being too suspicious or too sentimental. The truth was out in the open now, and with it came a kind of stillness that let me think clearly. I listened to each voicemail only once. Then I deleted them. I didn't save any. I didn't write anything down. I didn't play them for Margot or the lawyer. They weren't proof of anything I needed to argue in court. They were just noise, frantic, manipulative, confused. Every word laced with a different kind of pressure. Anger, guilt, flattery. The tone shifted from message to message, but the intent never changed. He wanted me to give in. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask how I felt about what he'd done. He asked why I was making things so hard, why I couldn't be reasonable, why I wouldn't just accept what he had so generously offered. I could hear it in his voice, that old belief. the one he'd held since he was a boy, and Peter let him win at board games too often. The belief that if he wanted something badly enough, and if he framed it as helpful, then no one had the right to say no, not even his mother. I sat in the kitchen one afternoon, the same kitchen he had tried to stage for photos, and stared at the dented kettle I'd had for over 20 years. Peter gave it to me after I burned the first one clean through. It whistled off key now, a little flat around the edges, but I kept it because it worked, because it reminded me of the kind of man Peter had been, steady, useful, and always apologetic when he got it wrong. Derek wasn't that kind of man. Maybe he never had been. I poured myself a cup of tea and stood by the back window, watching the ivy climb the porch railing. It had grown wild in recent years, curling up into the eaves like it was trying to hold the house in place. I used to worry it would damage the siding. Lately, I thought maybe it was doing what I couldn't, keeping everything rooted. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't throw anything or curse the air. What I felt wasn't rage, it was resolve. I walked to the drawer where I kept my papers, pulled out the notepad I used when I needed to think, and began to list the things I would need. Names of advocates, questions for the bank, resources for older women planning their own transitions. I had never expected to make this kind of move, not at this age, not alone. But I was ready. The next morning I made my bed, watered my plants, and called the local housing advocate Margot had recommended. Her name was Elise, and she sounded younger than I expected, but she listened with the kind of attentiveness that only comes from experience. I explained everything: the house, the forged documents, the listing that vanished just in time. I told her I didn't want to keep the house out of spite. I wanted to let it go on my terms. Elise didn't rush me. She asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. What kind of place did I want to live in? What did I need in order to feel safe, to feel free? I told her I didn't want a condo downtown. I didn't want granite countertops or rooftop yoga or a mailroom that echoed with strangers' footsteps. I wanted quiet, sunlight, bookshelves, a window that looked out on something green. She mentioned a cooperative for older women up in the mountains, about 2 hours north. It wasn't a retirement facility. It was a community, shared gardens, communal kitchens, private rooms, and enough space to live alone without feeling alone. The more she described it, the more I could picture it. A place where no one would ask what I planned to leave behind for someone else. A place where I could simply be. That afternoon I met with my lawyer again. We reviewed my options. I didn't want to rent. I didn't want to be bound by anyone's timelines but my own. So we set up a trust, something Derek couldn't touch or challenge. The house would be sold through a neutral third party, no friends of Derek, no contacts from his office, just clean paperwork, clean money, and a clean break. When the papers were ready, I signed them without hesitation. My hands didn't shake. I didn't second-guess the decision. The house had been mine, fully and legally, for over 40 years. It had sheltered me through grief, through aging, through the slow drift of family ties. Now it would shelter someone else. But only after I said goodbye on my own terms. I didn't tell Derek. I didn't leave a message or send a letter. He would find out when he found out. And when he did, there would be nothing left to contest. No leverage. No loopholes. Just a line he could no longer cross. Later that night, I sat on the back porch with a glass of lemonade and watched the last of the evening light touch the ivy one final time. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning I had waited too long to claim. The moving truck came on a Monday morning. The air was crisp, the sky clear in that pale way it gets before noon. I had packed slowly over the course of a week, not because I was sad to leave, but because I wanted to touch each thing one more time. Every book, every framed photograph, Every chipped teacup had earned its place. Not everything would come with me, and that was all right. Some things belonged to the house more than they ever belonged to me. Once the boxes were loaded, I asked the movers to wait. I wanted to walk through the house one last time by myself. I started in the garage. The light was softer there, slanting in through the small windows at an angle Peter always said was perfect for reading if you stood still enough. I traced my hand along the wooden workbench, then looked down at the cement floor. The names were still there, faint but legible. Peter had etched them with a screwdriver the day we poured the slab. Lorraine, Peter, Derek, age 9. I stood there a while, fingers resting on the old lettering, letting the memory live. In the kitchen, I paused by the stove. That corner still smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt toast. I remembered the mornings we'd all rush through breakfast, Derek trying to find his backpack, Peter buttoning his shirt with one hand while stirring oatmeal with the other. I had hated the chaos at the time. Now I could have bottled it. The hallway creaked in all the familiar places. I didn't step around them. I wanted to hear each sound, feel each board shift beneath my weight one last time. The living room still held echoes of laughter from holiday dinners, late-night puzzles, and quiet arguments that ended in apology. On the wall, behind the curtain rod, you could still see the nail hole where our first wedding photo had hung. Upstairs, I stood in the doorway of the sewing room. I hadn't packed anything from it. I wanted the new owner to decide what to do with the fabric, the spools, the little jars of buttons I had arranged by size and color over the years. It wasn't sadness I felt. It was satisfaction. That space had been fully mine. I had used it, loved it, and now I could let it go. I made my way back to the front hall, pausing to look out the window one last time. The ivy along the porch rails trembled slightly in the breeze, as if waving. I closed the door behind me slowly, careful not to let it slam. Then I taped a note to the glass. When I stepped into the car, the driver asked if I was ready. I nodded. As we pulled away, I didn't look back. Not because I was trying to be strong, but because I didn't need to. I had already said everything that mattered inside those walls. What came next belonged entirely to me. Derek showed up 2 days later, long after the papers were signed, the trust was sealed, and the keys were handed over to the neutral listing agent. I wasn't there to see it myself, of course, but the neighbor across the street, Clara, called to tell me what happened. She had lived there nearly as long as I had and knew how to read people without saying much. She said Derek pulled into the driveway in his sleek black car, the one he always parked at an angle like it was too special to be squared off like everyone else's. He stepped out wearing a suit that looked more like armor than clothing, phone in hand, walking fast toward the porch, as if momentum alone might undo what had already been done. But the door didn't open. The lock had been changed. The welcome mat was gone. The windows were bare. Clara said he knocked 3 times, then tried the knob, then stood back and looked at the house like he couldn't understand what he was seeing, as if something had been taken from him, as if something he thought he owned had slipped quietly out of reach. He stood there for a long while. She watched from behind her curtain as he paced in small circles, glanced at his phone, then at the flyer still posted in the window by the new agent. That flyer did not have his name on it. It didn't mention his brokerage. It didn't hint at anyone's generosity. It was clean, quiet, and final. He found the note taped to the front door, the one I had left behind, written in my own hand. I hadn't intended for it to be dramatic, just clear. It was never yours to flip. Love, Mom. I had folded the paper carefully, used thick tape to make sure it wouldn't fall in the wind. Clara said he stood there holding it for several seconds, not tearing it down, not crumpling it, just reading it. Then reading it again. Eventually, he got back into his car and drove off slowly, not in a rage, not slamming the door or revving the engine, but quiet, heavy, like someone who had finally been told no and realized it was going to stick. He didn't call me after that. Not that day, not that week. And I didn't wait for him to. I had already chosen what kind of silence I wanted to live in. The kind I could fill with something new, something mine. The first morning in my new home, I woke to the sound of wind through tall pines. No car alarms, no garbage trucks, no neighbors shouting from open windows. Just wind, soft and steady, moving through the branches like it had something to say, but no urgency to say it. I sat up slowly, letting the quiet fill my chest. It felt like something I hadn't breathed in years. The co-op was even more peaceful than Elise had described. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of place people bragged about, but it was exactly what I needed. My unit had one bedroom, a generous reading nook, and a kitchen that faced east, catching the light just after sunrise. The walls were bare when I arrived, but I brought only what mattered. A few photos, my sewing kit, 3 of Peter's old paperbacks, frayed at the spine and marked with his pencil notes in the margins. No one here asked about children. No one asked what I was leaving behind or why. The women here had all come with stories, many of them quiet, some still unfinished. They nodded in passing, invited me to bridge night, offered fresh cuttings from their succulents without waiting for introductions. There was a softness to it, a rhythm of respect built not on small talk, but shared understanding. I spent my afternoons on the porch that wrapped around the main building. It faced the mountains, and depending on the light, they looked either like shadows or sculpture. I started keeping a notebook by the window, jotting down memories, old family recipes, flashes of phrases I hadn't said out loud in years. At first, I thought I was writing them for Derek. Some part of me still wanted him to understand, but as the pages filled, I realized I wasn't writing for anyone else. I was writing for myself, to remember, to release. There was a small library near the common room. I asked if I could volunteer to help sort the new donations. The director smiled and handed me a key to the back room without hesitation. I spent a full afternoon alphabetizing the fiction shelf and never once looked at the clock. When the sun dipped low, I sat in the reading nook with a mug of chamomile and the windows open just enough to catch the breeze. It smelled faintly of pine and stone, like something ancient and clean. I thought about Derek sometimes, but not in anger. More like an ache that no longer hurt, but reminded me of where the wound had been. I hoped he found whatever it was he thought he needed. I hoped he learned what it meant to build something instead of just selling it. But I didn't dwell. My life was no longer paused in waiting. It had resumed, quietly and fully. And for the first time in a long while, it belonged only to me. I no longer check my phone for missed calls. I no longer glance toward the mailbox hoping for an apology letter that will never come. What I have now is not closure, not in the dramatic sense, but something better. Peace, earned and quiet, like the stillness after a long storm when you realize the roof held. Most days pass gently. I wake up with no demands, no roles to perform, no one else's version of my life pressing against the glass. I drink my tea slowly. I read until the words blur. I take long walks through the shaded paths behind the co-op, where the trees grow without pruning, and no one cuts back the ivy just to make it look neat. Here, beauty is allowed to take up space. I started my memoir last week. Nothing fancy, just a notebook, a decent pen, and a promise to tell the truth without polishing it. Not every chapter is about Derek. He doesn't deserve all the pages. Some are about Peter, some are about the house, some are about the woman I used to be when no one was watching. I write the way I used to speak before years of motherhood taught me to soften everything. I don't miss the house. I thought I would, but I don't. I miss the version of myself that lived inside it when Peter was alive, when Derek was still small enough to hold with one arm. But those versions had their time. What I have now is not smaller or lesser. It is simply mine. No one asks what I plan to leave behind. No one hints at future inheritance or real estate value, or how to better position myself for legacy. The only thing I'm expected to do here is live. And I do. I plant succulents in mismatched pots and give them names that make me laugh. I play bridge on Thursday nights and keep forgetting the score. I tell stories out loud without worrying who is listening. I say no when I mean no and yes when I mean yes. And no one makes me explain either one. This life is not something I salvaged from betrayal. It is something I built once I stopped waiting for someone else to protect what was mine. And now, finally, there is no noise, no apology needed, no permission asked. My life is no longer a favor or a placeholder, or a prize to be handled by someone else. It is mine, not for leverage, not for resale, just for living.